Welcome to episode number 23 of the ISPC Tailboard Talks. I'm your host, Mark, and Jerry is out driving around the country for the next couple weeks, so it'll be me solo for at least the next couple episodes, but that's okay. We got a special guest with us for these next Actually, we're going to be the next probably 5 or 6 episodes. We're going to be doing a podcast series around equipotential zones and field safety with special guest Jim Vaughn. Essentially for the next 5 or 6 episodes. Today our episode is EPZ, the law and the principles. So we're going to start at the ground floor and work our way upwards or outwards. And then the second episode of this series will be EPZ for distribution and URD. And then we'll transition to transmission and induction, and then into substations. And then our last episode will be around grounding trucks and step potential protection for the folks on the ground. And then potentially a 6th episode, depending on the questions that we may get from listeners. So throughout this series, if you have questions about anything that Jim and I talk about, you can send me an email at mark@ispconline.com, and I'll compile those questions over the next number of episodes. And if we have to close the gap there on anything or something we may go over that you don't quite understand, we'll see what we can do there. And we'll offer, it'll just be a back and forth with Jim and I on that Q&A, and he can answer questions. And then, if we got to go further in that, then maybe you'll need the services ISPC versus just some Q&A, but we'll see where that goes. So again, today's episode is titled EPZ, the law and the principles. So before I jump into this, though, I want to give a quick shout out to our sponsor for today's episode, which is T&D PowerSkills. Today's safety and training managers need flexible, effective solutions, and that's where T&D PowerSkills comes in. With a 78-unit curriculum designed for adult learners, you can control your training structure, control the scale of your delivery, and control your costs. Whether you're training a few crews or running a full apprenticeship program, visit tdpowerskills.com to learn more. That's tdpowerskills.com. So again, today we have, or for the next several episodes, we have our guest Jim Vaughn, who's a senior consultant for the Institute for Safety and Powerline Construction, an industry expert in grounding and bonding and safety and so on and so on and so on and some other things. Welcome, Jim. Glad to have you again.
And thank you, Mark. And for those of you listening, and Mark's been talking about the upcoming episodes. What we're doing here is essentially the presentation that we do when we go to see our clients to help them with their grounding programs. We do audits of grounding programs, we do training for grounding programs, and consulting with grounding programs. But when we come into an organization to do a training presentation, that's exactly what you're going to be seeing or hearing over the next few podcasts. So you're going to hear some information that will overlap, but that's going to be necessary as we progress through, and that's the reason why Mark has asked me to start today with the law and the principles, because they are the underlying reason and that we use the practices that we do and the requirements in order to comply with the law.
Yeah. Perfect. In these episodes that we're going to do, I'm going to keep the tailboard talk topic pretty brief in each of these episodes so that we can really get into the meat of why we're here and what we want to talk about. But essentially for every one of these episodes, again, we're talking about equipotential zones, right, in the different disciplines of our work. And so 1910-269 N3, tells us in OSHA that temporary protective grounds shall be placed at such locations and arranged in such a manner that the employer can demonstrate will prevent each employee from being exposed to hazardous differences in electrical potential. So, Jim, maybe, without diving too much into what we're going to talk about here in the main portion of our episode, maybe just a brief explanation. I think hopefully we assume that most people already know this working in our industry, but I continue to go places, and when you start talking about EPZ, they look at you like you got three eyeballs. So, what exactly is an equipotential zone, and kind of what's the principle behind it, right? Why should we be doing EPZ?
That's a very good place to start because you're right. And you and I, we pretty much do the same thing. We consult and we advise and we go and we visit with clients. And uh, over the years, which I think is 10 years that I've been working with ISPC, I have probably 300 clients, and it's there are a number of them that still don't do EPC because they don't think that it's required. And that's part of the issue that we have here, and it may have something to do with the way that we entitle the practices that we do. And by that, what I mean is that we hear references to grounding for personal protection, which is a phrase that OSHA used exclusively since around 1994. Grounding for personal protection. Now, what people didn't realize was that when OSHA said grounding for personal protection, they assumed that everybody understood that grounding for personal protection meant creating an equipotential zone or EPZ, but that simply wasn't true. Now, I don't know exactly what happened in 2014, but because I've had a couple of conversations with the guy that authored the changes in the standard. He is a consultant for the industry now, having retired from OSHA, and we've actually been across from each other in litigations, and some of them having to do with grounding. So when we meet each other, we're not actually supposed to talk to each other because we're on opposite sides of litigation somewhere. But I've had enough conversations with him, and I know enough about what OSHA did and how they did stuff. When they looked at the performance for grounding, they made a number of changes in the 2014 revisions of the standard, which really had nothing to do with grounding because it was supposed to be about personal protective devices, but they used the opportunity to make a number of changes and updates to a number of sections of the code for dealing with our industry. And one of the things that they changed was the reference that you read, Mark, in our tailboard uh, to open up this session. And it's that rule in OSHA. But the difference in the rule from before the 2014 standard and after the 2014 standard was published is simply the title. The rule was the same since 1994. It says that when you install grounding, that it shall be arranged to ensure that nobody is exposed to difference in equipotential. And I am paraphrasing there what the requirements of the standard are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when people looked at the rule since 1994 and since 1974, when the first standards were established, they didn't understand what OSHA was requiring because OSHA didn't explain it very well. Now, remember when we started this part of the conversation, we said that when OSHA says grounding for personal protection, they intend or assume that everybody understands that that means equipotential bonding or
Mm-hmm.
equipotential grounding. Well, apparently they finally figured out, hey, people aren't getting it because up until 2014, people were still dying on the job.
Hmm.
And as I have said before, and as we can show in a number of the investigations, we do a number of third party investigations and we do a number of litigations that involved fatalities on grounded systems. We say that the worker was killed by the grounding that he installed for his protection. So that's what we think OSHA was looking at. They're saying, hey, people aren't getting this, and why? And then they looked at it and they said, oh, it doesn't have a title. And
Hmm.
all they did in 2014 was put a title on the rule, and the title said equipotential grounding. Now, that title, that phrase, equipotential grounding, that is the only place in the whole of the standard that OSHA uses that phrase. And even in the rule that they wrote, and that's the rule that Mark read to you before we started this, even in that rule, they don't say that they don't use the phrase equipotential grounding.
Hmm.
So it still took a while for people to figure out what we were talking about. And when the rule came out, we had a number of people that would call us. And when I was consulting, working, excuse me, with another organization, because the rule came out before I came to ISPC, even though I was consulting for ISPC at the time, I had people calling me saying, "What are we going to do about this new rule?" And we said, "Well, what new rule is that?" And they said, the rule for equipotential grounding." And I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And they would refer to that standard. I said,
Hmm.
that's not a new rule. That's the same rule that's always been there. It just has a title on it now, and there you go.
Hmm.
That's the way that people were misunderstanding what the intention of the standard was. Now we have a history of grounding for personal protection. Even if we didn't phrase it that way in the industry, we assumed that we would be grounding, and that would protect workers, and that's where the whole idea of bracket grounding came from. And we used to just say bracket grounding, and everybody knew that we meant putting up grounds on either side of our workspace.
Yep.
And when I was a lineman, we were bracket grounding. I had no idea how it worked because nobody ever asked me about it. Nobody ever told me about it. I didn't even think about how it might possibly work, even though I had a basic understanding, of electrical theory. I just thought, I don't know, maybe this. I just thought the grounding stopped. I simply never thought about it.
Hmm.
So we've always had this idea of bracket grounding. Well, when the rule came out and when the rule said each employee shall be protected from the hazards that might arise from equipment contact, when we were talking about equipment contact, it said that we bonding equipment together, using the best available ground to minimize the time it's going to sorry, got my train of thought was screwed up in my head here, saying that um, we just assumed that what we were
Hmm.
doing and what the requirements of the standard were had to do with our age-old bracket grounding.
Right.
But the what's really missing from our history is not understanding that in the law recognizes, or the OSHA standard recognizes, what most people do not know, and that is that all the way back from 1955, Bonneville Power did a study because, see, somebody at Bonneville Power said, well, how does grounding work? And
Hmm.
so they decided to do some high current research on wooden transmission poles at the time is what they were testing on. And the conclusion of their study, which was published by the IEEE, said bracket grounding does not ensure protection of the worker. To ensure protection of the worker, you must bond the pole into the grounding scheme to prevent that worker from being exposed to any difference in potential.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very short summary of the 8 conclusions that they drew. But we've known since 1955 that simply grounding without creating an equipotential zone for the worker would not ensure protection. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today is this historical misunderstanding
Mm-hmm.
of why grounding was not protecting us at the same time it was protecting us, because of the difference between incidental protection and uh, the way that
Intentional.
our
Yeah.
systems are built. Yeah, intentional protection.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Yeah.
reminding me. Um, uh, but besides Bonneville, Puget Sound Power in 1988 tested the Bonneville conclusions and came up with the exact same conclusions and published those and made those available and found out the exact same thing, that that simply bracket grounding or simply grounding a circuit did not protect the worker.
Mm-hmm.
So where equipotential grounding did, and even though they didn't always call it equipotential grounding. So that's been part of the problem historically, and the reason why we don't get it, and the reason why their people are still out there, because they have been traditionally trained. And it might have even something to do with the way that we train linemen. We have
Mm-hmm.
classroom training, but right now, you can go to some utilities, you can even go to some co-op or muni associations in different states, and you can look at their production of their safety manuals. And their safety manuals do not require equipotential grounding. And
Mm-hmm.
that's still the case in 2025. And even though they mention it, but they also say things, and I'm not going to specifically say who does this, but this is exactly what we see. We'll see explanations in there that says that if your brackets are only one span away, then it'll be sufficient to protect the worker. Well, that you cannot say with any assurance that that's the case,
Yep.
and that's part of the problem.
Yeah.
So the next question is going to be, why do people get protected by grounding and then assume that grounding provides that kind of protection?
Yeah.
And that's really now leaning into the principles.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about principles, we have to understand something. These principles are built on it, it's not theory. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
these are absolutes. In order, what do you call it when you use physics? Sorry, here we
Yeah.
go again.
Physics.
One of the cool things about podcasts is that we're really having a discussion here. I'm not working
Yeah.
from a PowerPoint program that's guiding me through,
Right.
what to say. So I'm bringing this up through all this last 2 decades that I've been doing this research, and
Yeah.
so I'm trying to make sure that we explain this in the podcast to people who are listening without the benefit of a graphic that they can study or a manual
Sure.
that they can study. So when we talk about these principles, we are talking about these absolutes that cannot change. They are
Mm-hmm.
fundamentals of the physics of electrical current flow and the physics of electricity. And when we say a principle, it's kind of like grounding. People call, I mean, not grounding, I'm sorry, gravity.
Yep.
Gravity is not a theory, it's a principle. It's physics. You
Mm-hmm.
cannot argue that gravity is not real. If you try to demonstrate that it's not real, you're probably going to fall down and hurt yourself in that demonstration, thereby proving that it is real.
Right.
And that's the thing about electrical current. when it comes to grounding is that electricity is electricity. It's going to be the same no matter what you do with it. There are varying degrees of current flow according to how many circuits are available, the resistance to those circuits, and and the division of current among all of those circuits. And that's where we're at, where so many people misunderstand what it is that we're talking about. So when we teach grounding at ISPC, we start with three principles that if everybody understood the principles, then everybody would understand and figure out how to properly ground their work location. So our first principle is that current flows in every available path inversely proportional to the resistance of the path. So if I'm at the top of a structure and I have a pole bond with a ground rod at the bottom of it, and I have a static and I have a neutral, and I have a span away a structure on either side with that same arrangement. And if I go and hang a set of grounds on that pole, and this would just be from neutral to phase to phase to phase, or from if there's a static on the pole, from the overhead static to phase to phase to phase. if if I close that feeder in and energize that circuit while I'm standing on the pole holding that conductor, when that happens, principle number one occurs. Current flows in every available path. So I close the bus switches, and when the current comes down the bus into the grounded bus, it is going to divide into every available pathway. So there's one pathway from A to B and B to C, and then there's one pathway from that short circuited bus down to the neutral or up to the static, and then from the static or the neutral onto the pole bond. And then from the pole bond, if it's from the static, then it's going to come down the pole bond, and it's also going to now involve the neutral, and it's going to continue down the pole into the ground rod. Every one of those pathways have a different resistance to them. So the current divides proportional to the resistance of each of the pathways. So the issue for the lineman is that if the lineman is standing on the pole that's bonded and has an incidental connection by engineering design to the static, then there is going to be a difference in voltage on the pole between the pole static and between the pole bond. And if it's a neutral, it's going to be the same thing. Every one of them is going to have a different amount of current flowing through it because of the resistance of that pathway. Mm-hmm. That is where all of the voltages appear that create the problem. Mm-hmm. So if I have current pathway in a pole bond and current pathway in a static and a current pathway in a neutral, each one of them has a different resistance. So each one of them across that resistance is going to have a different potential. And if I get between those potentials, that's where I get hurt. And that's where the problem arises, because and we keep saying this, incidental and intentional. If I have incidental connections, which everything in our system is interconnected, they're all tied together. Those incidental connections produce somewhat of a voltage drop and create some form of incidental protection. So I'm holding on to the static. Let's say I'm replacing a static, the connection to the pole, the mechanical connection to the pole, and the static is bonded to the pole. My feet on my hooks are in the pole. My hands are on the static. Well, there is a pole bond that's there that is creating somewhat of a bond between the wood pole and the static. but there is no assurance that that wood pole bond connection is going to create protection for the worker because of the resistance across that pole bond. And that
Mhm.
resistance across that pole bond is what creates the voltage in the presence of the worker. Am I there yet, Mark?
Well, and I think the other question I had, Jim, so you kind of talked about inadvertent energization of your phase conductors, right? The other thing I think folks, linemen tend to maybe overlook a little bit is okay, I have a work zone developed right through blocking, through switching and tagging, right, where my phase conductors are open. I have visible opens, but my neutral, right, is still a system conductor and it's a current carrying conductor, right? So let's say outside of my work zone, I have a fault, right? Tree comes down on a line, car runs into a pole, whatever, you name it, right? That neutral now becomes that current carrying conductor into my work zone and can create as much of a problem as if I was to accidentally energize my phase conductors, right? It's still a concern. It's still going to bring uh, fault potential into my work zone through that neutral conductor.
And that's an appropriate concern because that's exactly where the risk arises.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, we've been told forever, and everybody knows this. It's not the voltage that kills you; it's the current.
Right.
So what we're doing when we bond ourselves in is we're trying to reduce the voltage that we're exposed to. And that voltage that we're exposed to is created by the current flow available in the system. So what you're asking is important to understand because it doesn't matter what the current source is, wherever the current comes from, it's flowing through the system and it creates a risk for the worker. And that's an important concept because what people don't realize is that there is always current flowing in our systems, in our grounded systems.
Mm-hmm.
We get used to thinking about, let's say, our homeowners, our home residential system. For the protection of individuals in any building, commercial building, industrial building, plant building, home building, the rule is the same for all electrical circuits. The neutral and the ground are kept separate from each other. The only place that the neutral and ground can be electrically tied together is at the service entrance at the first means of disconnect. And the whole reason for doing so is to ensure that the ground system has no normal continuing source of current flowing on it, except in the case of a fault, which is what the purpose of the ground wire is there for, to ground systems that could expose a worker if there was a short circuit or expose a homeowner or a kid with a toaster or anything like that if there was a short circuit in a metal enclosed conductive device. So that ground stays isolated. So there is never current flowing on the ground. But in our systems, they are always connected together. Now, some exposures are worse than others. For instance, inside of a substation, you have current flowing in every ground system, and when we go and train on substations, we show photographs of our own meters where we have taken our meters and we have metered the ground connections on transformers and on columns in the pole and on switch gear frames, and we show, look, there's current flowing here, and this
Mm-hmm.
isn't a fault, this is a normal operation. Well, the whole design of a substation is to keep that substation at a zero potential difference. So anybody walking through the substation, walking across the ground, is standing over an equipotential mat that's tied to the column, tied to the transformers. Everything is tied together. So if something goes wrong inside the substation, you're protected by equipotential. And substations have always been built that way. That's another question. Well, if we knew that about substations, how come we didn't know that about a structure that's out in the distribution system or in the transmission system? But you're absolutely right, Mark. System neutrals have current flowing on them, and it doesn't matter if I open the three-phase switches on Fifth Street. If I've got parallel circuits on 4th Street and on 8th Street, and the crossing intersection and the junction poles, the neutrals on every feeder out of that substation are tied together. That rule, current flowing in every available path, according to the proportional resistance to the path, means that the neutral for the circuit on 5th Street and 8th Street and 10th Street are all tied together. So it doesn't matter if I open up the circuit on 8th Street. The neutral can still be carrying current because it is part of that interconnected system, which is the reason why we never open up a neutral. If we open up a neutral, what happens? We get a voltage between those two open ends, and the way that we teach it is that voltage could be equal to the system voltage. Now, it's not, and the reason it's not is because of that multi-grounded system. That it's not intentional, because that's not why they did it. The reason why they created a multi-grounded system was for the efficiency of relaying and circuit protection, not to protect the worker. We derive some benefit from that because that multi-grounded system helps to keep the voltage low on a system neutral. So, we've got utilities and contractors all over the place that will barehand a system neutral, ignoring the fact that it has current flowing through it because they say, well, it's grounded, it's safe to touch. Well, it might be safe to touch, but what would happen if that neutral connection to the pole bond was not there, or if it came loose? Or what would happen if I needed to create a double dead end and I put that neutral in a hoist and I cut that neutral in order to create a double dead end? Well, I'm not going to do that without macking it out. Why? Because if I cut that neutral, we've been taught and we know we could have system voltage in there. Multi-grounding keeps that voltage very low, but anybody in this industry that ever goes and puts a neutral back together, or puts a URD neutral in a ditch back together, or makes a static connection to a pole, especially if it's dark, will see those little sparks when I touch those conductors together. What that should be telling us is, hey, why are those sparks there? They're there because there is a current available creating a difference in potential. And until I make that connection, then that difference in potential is going to exist. And if that difference in potential is high enough, what's going to happen? You're going to get electrocuted. So that's the reason why we use these principles. So let me. I never did get through the principles because I'm trying to do a very, very, very deep dive into why things the way that they are, and I don't want to get. It's a lot of information, so I'm trying to explain it in several different ways so that we understand it. So let's go back to that first principle. Current flows in every available path, inversely proportional to resistance of the path. Now we've already beat that one to death. Every possible path is going to have current flowing in it, and that means that current, just like Mark said, is everywhere throughout our system. It's always there, and it's not going to go away unless we completely isolate it. So we've got current flow in every available path. So principle number 2 is, if I insert a resistance in a current carrying grounded conductor, a voltage rise will appear across that resistance, and that voltage will be proportional to the resistance in that path. So we have proportional current. In other words, the current's proportion to the multiple pathways, the resistance in each pathway. But if I insert a resistance, and that goes back to cutting that system neutral. If I cut that system neutral and open it up, that's inserting a resistance. And what's going to happen? What would happen if I bare hand grab both ends of that conductor? It's going to electrocute me or shock me, depending on how much current is available and how many grounds, and those are those incidental grounds across the system, are creating that, are keeping that voltage low. So
Mm-hmm.
principle number one, current flows in every available path. Principle number two, if I insert a resistance in that path, a voltage is going to appear across that resistance. And by the way, a very simple demonstration of that is, we have hotspots. If you're a utility, and you get sent out to a customer with flickering voltage, and you go to the pole where the service connection is, and you've got an A to A bolt-on connector that's there, and you can hear it arcing because over the years it's kind of gone bad.
Mm-hmm.
So if you took a voltmeter and you put a voltmeter on the neutral and you put a voltmeter on the number two service going to the house, you'll see a voltage there. And that voltage will flicker every time that little connector flickers at the same time because of the resistance in that connector. So that resistance in that connector creates a voltage. And if I get between those two voltages, that's what's going to hurt me. The
Mm-hmm.
very first fatality that I ever did on power line was an apprentice who was sliding a connector, uh, to get it closer to the pole, bare hand,
Mm-hmm.
with his hand on the neutral and his hand on the connector. And the resistance as he was sliding that connector created a voltage between his right hand and his left hand, and it killed him. Who ever thought that that little flickering voltage and that flickering light, but that's the principle that creates that potential. That's that number two. If I insert a resistance in a current carrying conductor. So whether it's a connector or whether it's a cut neutral or whether it's a bad connection in a span, wherever I have resistance in that system, a voltage is going to appear across that resistance. And then the third one is that if that voltage across that resistance is higher than 50 volts, I can be electrocuted. Now, we use 50 volts because that's a universal number, universally accepted, and that comes all the way back from the work that Dalziel did, about AC current effect on the human body. And what he was testing, was how much did it take to break the resist? I mean, to injure a human body exposed to electrical current. And over the course of doing that testing, he noticed that different people had different resistances, and it took different voltages to break that resistance in order for current to flow across the body. And from his work, we established that 50 volts was a universal number that we would use for the computation of risks to the worker. It may be higher, it may be lower. Most of the time for us in the industry, it's higher, because we have things like, um, rough, thick skin on our hands from being in craft work forever, and then we got a pair of leather gloves on top of that, and then we got a pair of boots on that limits the current flow that's available because those boots are a resistor, the gloves are a resistor, the skin in our hands are a resistor. But what it boils down to, if the voltage is high enough to penetrate that resistance of our skin, now current can flow, and that current is what does that damage. So those three principles that we have to understand in order to understand the nature of the risk and to treat it
Great
appropriately.
explanations. I think we've kind of established the law and the principles, right? We'll kind of move
Mm-hmm.
on from our tailboard talk segment there, and we'll move into we'll start diving a little deeper into this. Before I do that, hey folks, if you're responsible for training line workers, you know the challenges, regulation change, crews come and go, and training must continue, right? So that's why T&D PowerSkills is such a game changer. With 78 modules built specifically for adult learners, you can control your message, control the scale of your training program, from quick refreshers to a full 8,000 hour DOL certified apprenticeship. and control your training costs, regardless of whether you're a small contractor or a major utility. It's flexible, it's effective, it's built for the way we train today. Check out tdpowerskills.com. Again, that's tdpowerskills.com. I guess I got some I guess you could call it not necessarily questions, but topics, Jim, that we can kind of build on those laws and principles. And so I guess you know we know EPZ is addressed in OSHA, in the OSHA standard. So what are and I know you do a lot of litigation, right, and so on. So let's kind of establish right out of the gate here what happens or what are the implications or consequences, right, for when it comes to complying with OSHA. What happens when we don't do what we're supposed to be doing, right? And we touched on it earlier, how many times both of us run into situations out there where companies are not following, and this is just one standard we're talking about, right? Equipotential grounding or equipotential zones. What's putting aside, we know people are going to get hurt because they continue to do it, right? But what's the flip side of that, right?
Yeah.
What's the implication and the consequences when you don't follow this stuff?
And this is a good place to wrap up where we're at right now
Yeah,
before we head into the next podcast, because the next podcasts are going to be about the specific exposures and how to deal with them.
yeah,
One, people don't realize, everybody knows that we have a risky work environment that we're in.
yeah,
But I can tell you that a half a dozen of our clients that we have done grounding training for came to us after they had a ground incident where someone was injured or killed. And it had never happened before. And so we have utilities that have been in business for over 100 years, never had a ground related fatality, did have one. And then when they looked at it, they couldn't figure out why and what had happened. And that's why they came to us and they said, "Hey, what went wrong?" And so we start to explain to them the principles. But besides them wanting to care for their employees to make this never, happen again, they now have they're getting ready to go for a ride, and that ride's going to have two parts to it. One of them is going to be OSHA, and OSHA is going to come in, going to hold that employer liable for not having followed those rules. And of course, sometimes when we're talking about protecting the employer, we'll get some people, and there'll be people on the podcast that your very first thought is, well, this isn't about the employer, this is about protecting the worker. Well, actually, it is, because they're one and the same. If we help an employer comply with the standard and create that safety environment, then that employee is going to be protected. So if we protect the employer, we protect the worker. If we protect the worker by creating good programs, good practices, good safety manual rules, then we also protect the employer. Because that's the very first thing that's going to happen. Now, OSHA is going to come in. They're going to make a claim. They're going to assess the employer. The employer has a certain amount of time to challenge the assessment, and all of that takes place within about 6 months. What people don't see is the other part of that. We can go to the internet any day, and we can go to Facebook, and we can get onto our favorite line worker sites or substation worker sites, and we'll hear a story about somebody being killed, and that's a horrible thing. And everybody wants to help out and help that family, and has a lot of sympathy, and is very close knit because that's where we work. But they don't realize that what's going to happen about 2 years or 3 years from now, because that's how long that it takes to get the civil litigations into the courtroom. I have right now, I think, 23 litigations that I'm working on. Almost every one of them are more than the event that the litigation is based on occurred more than 3 years ago. And
Mm.
now when the litigation happens, nobody ever hears about that, or nobody ever hears about the outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
or how, because I mean, I challenge almost anybody out there in the podcast world, and we may have hundreds of people or thousands of people listening to the podcast. Very few of them actually know the details of litigation that occurred 3 or 4 years after an incident. But see, families don't just go away. Our coworker may be gone, but that family still has to resolve themselves and take care of themselves, and that's what happens in litigation. So when we protect an employer by helping them create an effective program, we protect those workers at the same time, but we're also protecting your family. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's more important to me than anything, because every time I go into a courtroom, I see the families
Yeah.
that are left behind, and now they're having to go through it all over again. And that's
Yeah.
one of the things that I don't like about litigation when the families are in there, because we're discussing, just like it happened yesterday, their loved one who died on the job.
Yeah.
So those other things that are going on that we don't always recognize that have a large impact on our industry, but also can have a very large impact on our families.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Just one last quick one, Jim, and then we'll wrap this episode up. So, when it comes to the laws and the principles, right? And I'm going to do this with each segment as we go through this series. Whether you're the line worker out there working, or the crew lead, the safety manager, the supervisor, whatever the case may be, when it comes to the laws and principles, what's one key takeaway that, if they get nothing else out of listening to this entire episode, what's that key point you want them to take away about the laws and the principles?
If you're a supervisor, and this goes all the way down to a lineman over an apprentice, that's a supervisor relationship.
Yep.
If that apprentice is hurt on the job, you're going to have to answer for your part in that incident. Now, we all have to do that ethically anyway, because we
Mm-hmm.
think about what could I have done. But the problem is that that's where the law comes into place, because the law seeks to find out who is responsible and who it is that's going to pay the penalty. So we have all the solutions right there. And if you're a supervisor or a foreman or a coworker, and if you're available when that litigation gets there, you're going to be deposed, and they're going to ask you some very hard questions about what you were doing. And you can be individually held partially responsible for the event that occurred. Now, that's a scary kind of a thing that every supervisor ought to understand, because when you let people break the rules, that creates some accountability for yourself over what happened.
Yeah.
But you have absolutely nothing to worry about if you follow the rules.
Yeah.
If you know the law, and if you follow the law, if you know the rule that says that you're supposed to equipotential protect, and you ensure that that's being done, you can't be held accountable for the incident that occurred,
Mm-hmm.
because you did what you were supposed to do.
Yeah.
And that's a very important concept, because it actually does two things. It protects you from the law, it protects you from, uh, but it also protects your family and yourself from being exposed,
Yeah.
to that, because you're doing what you're supposed to do. You'll never ever have to be deposed. You'll never ever hear or be a part of an investigation, because you followed the rules.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you have any personal integrity, you can lay your head down at night knowing that, hey, I did the right thing. I held my people accountable, right? And essentially not let this thing eat you up for the rest of your life when one of the people that work for you or work with you gets injured, right?
Yeah, and the good news is that at ISPC, we say that accountability has two sides to it. Either heads will roll in
Yeah.
accountability, or we're going to have a party. You see,
Yep.
if you did everything right, that's good, and you can celebrate that, and you can live with that confidence, and you never be exposed to this at all. Your families are important, and
Yeah.
we don't stress that enough. You spend time in courtroom looking at families having to redo the death of their loved one. You start to
Yeah.
see how important these families are, and you don't think about that when you're going to work on your way there. If I'm breaking the rules, you are essentially abandoning your family.
Yeah, it kind of brings home that see something, say something, it shines
Yes,
a whole new light on that, right? If I, I think probably everybody in their career has done it at some point or another, right? You look at something and be like,
I don't have time.
uh, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah,
I'll let it slide this time, right? Yeah, exactly. And so I can't stress enough if whether it's coworker to coworker or like you said, even if you're a journeyman, right, and you got an apprentice working for you, you're still in that leadership role, right? You might not have a leadership title, but it's your duty to say something to that individual if he's doing something wrong and potentially going to get himself hurt, right? Can't stress enough to you will fully regret not opening your mouth if you should have and something really bad goes wrong. So again, if you do have questions, Mark at ispconline.com. We'll collect those questions. And then at the end of this series of podcasts, we'll have if we need to, we will have a Q&A to close all those questions out and get you the answers you need. So training and safety professionals face more pressure than ever to keep their line worker programs compliant, current, and cost effective. T&D PowerSkills offers a 78-unit curriculum that gives you total control to customize the training content to match your specific needs, control over your delivery, whether you're doing short refreshers or managing a full DOL certified 8,000-hour apprenticeship. And best of all, you can control how the program scales to fit your operation no matter what that size is. It's trusted by utilities and contractors nationwide. Visit tdpowerskills.com and see how you can take control of your training. Again, that's tdpowerskills.com. I'd like to thank them for today's sponsorship of this episode. And then in closing, as always, the views and opinions shared in this podcast are the personal viewpoints of the participants and may not necessarily reflect the stance of the Institute for Safety and Powerline Construction and its staff. It's highly advised to consult your company management before implementing any actions or policy changes. Please support the sponsors bringing this content to you. And for more episodes of ISPC Tailboard Talk, subscribe in your favorite podcatcher and be sure to leave a review. We would love to hear from you. Thanks to Jim for all his input and knowledge. Greatly appreciated. Thanks to T&D PowerSkills, and we will catch you on the next episode of ISPC Tailboard Talks.